So you can see that NVIDIA is recovering a bit from the after hours action yesterday after the earnings report. And the interesting part for me here is to look at some of the details that they had regarding the gross margin, because remember that my expectations for 2025 in terms of NVIDIA's AI GPU sales is to go from around 90 billion this year to, let's say, around 110 billion, give or take 10-15 billion plus minus. So the revenue will increase, but the details that are interesting is the gross margin. We know that the highest gross margin they had this year was in Q1, 78.4%. Then it decreased by around 3 percentages to 75.1. Now they guided for next quarter, Q3, to have around 75, and for the entire year also 75. So with those numbers in mind, we can see here that in order for NVIDIA's full year 2024 to be around 75% gross margin, knowing the first two quarters and assuming that the guidance for Q3 is correct, they would need around 72% gross margin in Q4. And there were some questions raised on the call about this. A couple of the analysts kind of pushed the company on this, and Jensen and the CFO tried to explain it by saying that it's mostly due to the redesigning cost for the delayed black chip B100 chip that everyone is talking about. There have been a lot of discussions that there's been some issues in the manufacturing, so they have to retool and do some stuff differently, and that's where the company is saying the cost is coming from, or let's say the reduction in gross margin. But maybe that's not the entire part of the story, because we are not talking about, it might be just 3%. But if you think about it, 3% gross margin reduction on a revenue of around 100 billion or 110 billion for the entire year, that's roughly $3 billion reduction in gross margin. So 3 billion difference in gross margin due to a couple of issues with the manufacturing of one single chip. I don't think that's the whole story, because remember, NVIDIA's R&D budget on a quarterly basis is around 2.5 billion. So are you telling me that a couple of issues with the ramp up of B100, that is, according to NVIDIA themselves, a kind of minor issue, is that's gonna cost the company $2 or $3 billion? Now, I think it might be part of the issue, but the most likely reason, in my opinion, is that NVIDIA finally starting to feel some kind of pressure in the pricing power. Because remember, they had a good year or 18 months lead. But AMD is projected to do 4.5 and 5.5 billion sales of AI data center GPU. That might not sound a whole lot compared to NVIDIA's projected 90 plus billion this year. But remember, AMD is doubling again most likely next year to, let's say, 10-12 billion next year. Although NVIDIA will also have a healthy increase, but maybe not 100% increase, but more like a 20, 30, 40% at best. That's what I'm looking at right now. In addition to that, remember that AMD's 12 billion, let's go with the 12 billion number for next year, because that's essentially 10% of my expectations of NVIDIA's next year as well. That's on revenue terms. But if you look at the average selling price for AMD's MI300, they are selling at half the price. So if AMD manages to get 12 billion of revenue from MI300 and all the derivatives, that's like 24 billion for NVIDIA in terms of number of units shipped. Remember, if you're having 10% of the market share in terms of revenue, but you're selling your chips at half the price, you're giving away more than around 2 times more chips compared to NVIDIA at the same price normalization. So that's why I think, maybe we're starting, but it's not only AMD. We know that, for example, even Intel is trying their feet in the AI data center GPU with Gaudi 3. Not a whole lot of revenue for this year, for 2024, at around half a billion US dollar. But also we know that Google is doing their own TPUs. They're taking a lot of, nice traction there. Even Apple is using Google's TPUs for their own AI kind of solutions. We also know that Amazon is doing that as well, and we also know that Microsoft is also looking at that, and I believe even Meta did that. So there's a lot of different companies trying to take a piece of NVIDIA's hundreds of billion of AI data center sales. So is that what we are seeing? Possibly, but again, remember that NVIDIA's numbers yesterday were solid. At our earnings per share of $68 per share, 0.68 cents. That's gonna give you a full year of earnings per share on this run rate at around 2.8 to 3 US dollar. And at the current stock price, it's very easy to calculate the PE ratio then. So you just take the stock price of 123 divided with, let's say, divided by 3. So you get a PE ratio of 41. Although quite expensive for a tech stock, but not for maybe for the market leader with 75% gross margin and nice, interesting, expectations for next year as well, in terms of at least revenue growth. But again, it's also to the point that you should remember you really need to follow the gross margin for Q3 and the guidance for Q4. If they guide it down a bit, I don't think the market will react really well, because if this is the height of NVIDIA's margin, and if they are plateauing and at some point slow it down a bit and going below 70%, maybe 2025 or 2026, despite the revenue increase, the net income will at best stabilize at this stage. And that wouldn't, show a company that is growing, at least not our earnings per share. So that's maybe the worry for NVIDIA in my opinion. But anyways, leaving NVIDIA, we briefly mentioned AMD's expectations for next year. Even if you are extremely conservative and think that this number 12 billion is way too overconfident, even if we do a 8 billion for AMD next year, it's still very good for AMD, because that's gonna give them some really nice net income. And looking at some discussions about, for example, NVIDIA's Blackwell, remember that Blackwell is two big 800 square millimeters or so dies glued together, right? So when you are comparing Blackwell, like Anantech does here, the B100 compared to, let's say, H100 here, you can see, sure, the B100 and 200 are much better than H100. For example, at 32, at the FP16, they are around 2 or 2.3 times better, sure. And then at also they add at FP floating point 4, they are adding capabilities that wasn't natively supported by H100 or, for example, AMD's MI300. But remember that H100 is essentially a single 800mm die, whereas B200 is two of them glued together. Obviously, B200 is also utilizing a slightly, maybe 5 to 10% improvement of TSMC 4NP node compared to H100's 4N node. So there's some, manufacturing additional capabilities being, in terms of transistor density, added due to TSMC's manufacturing capability as well. So it's not only a bigger die, it's also a slightly better manufacturing process node. But all that being equal, we know that B200 is also going to increase the price. So it's already AMD has an advantage in terms of pricing. They are selling them at around half the price. So as we go into next year, there's possibilities that AMD's MI325X, which will be launching in a couple of months, and the very well important MI350X, if they have continue to have this lower price compared to NVIDIA, and continue to also be very competitive with NVIDIA, I think that's gonna maybe be one of the reasons why NVIDIA's margins might slightly go down. And don't forget that MI300 is much more stronger in terms of, let's say, from the originally it was more meant for high performance computing. Now high performance computing, you are in need of matrix executions of FP32 and double precisions like if FP64, and these are more exact calculations that are needed. And as you can see, for each doubling of precision, the teraflops goes down. So FP64 is the most precise calculations which you are needing in high performance computing. For example, if you are doing any, for example, weather forecasts, the more data and more precise data you have, more precise outcome you get there. But for example, AI training, you are seeing most workloads at this other end, so where you have less precision, because you don't need that for those kind of calculations. And why is that important? Well, not any single chip can be optimized for all these different workloads. So you have to pick, either you design your chip to supporting a few of these this other lower end with less precise, or the other end with high precision. And for high performance computing, you need, you know, FP64 and so on. But for AI, you need to even go further down. You can see, as I mentioned, that Blackwell is gonna support a native FP4, and AMD's 350 MI350 will also do that. And you can see here, for example, their execution goes, as we go from FP8 to FP4 from Blackwell, it goes from 4,500 to 9,000. And believe me, AMD is gonna follow suit. For example, look at MI300, compare FP8 to NVIDIA's H100. You can see that this is MI300 at around 2,600 teraflops compared to NVIDIA's 1,980. So AMD was already ahead of NVIDIA theoretically, although there's a lot of different stuff with the software stack and so on, but on pure hardware. Now, we can see that as Blackwell joins the picture in Q4 of this year, they're gonna, you know, have a lead in FP8. But I do expect, when I look at, for example, when I look at AMD's MI350X, which will be launched next year, AMD is telling that they are very confident that that will beat, for example, NVIDIA's Blackwell. And if Blackwell is at 4,500, maybe, you know, maybe MI350 will be at 6,000 or 7,000. So I think NVIDIA is facing more trouble next year than they did last year and this year. And simply because, again, AMD was 1 year behind NVIDIA, and they are, you know, now finally optimizing, actually developing the MI350X purely on AI workload, whereas you could say that MI300 and MI325X is more a hybrid of, you know, essentially trying to do both of them, you know, doing a bit of high performance computing and a bit of AI. So it's not fully optimized for, I think, you know, the AI workloads. It can do that quite well, and in some instances very well, but the real 300-pound gorilla from AMD is MI350. I think that's the first one we will judge AMD in terms of, are they capable to kind of surpass NVIDIA, at least on the hardware side. I think they can do it. That's why I'm so confident on AMD. But again, remember that NVIDIA is also here to stay. They are the king, and they have the revenues to show for it. And although the gross margin might go down a bit in the worst case scenario, they still have huge sales. So I think the stock will, you know, at best, you know, in the worst case scenario, maybe go down 10, 20, 30% for next year. But then, knowing Jensen right, he always finds stuff to invest in that no one else sees. He saw the AI rise, he saw the Bitcoin mining boom. So I think there's, whatever is out there, the next one, he's gonna see that most likely. And although I also think that AI is not gonna disappear now, maybe it will be a less amount of intensive investments after a couple of, you know, the first 2-3 years. But I think there's the AI is still here to stay, because you can see that there are so many new softwares out there doing video editing and doing like stuff that are just, you know, insane in terms of, you know, video editing. So I think AI is gonna boost productivity quite a bit. So I'm not worried for NVIDIA, at least at this current stage. But I think it's interesting to look at the gross margin and see for yourself. And for Intel, everything looks dire right now, but I think, you know, the stock is very cheap, and they are doing the necessary stuff. They are cutting the, you know, number of people working there, but at least 15,000. I'm thinking they will do it double that in the upcoming 18 months. I think at least 25,000 people will sadly leave their jobs. But that's required for Intel, because Intel is quite bloated, and also I think the valuation is low. They have the backing of American state, the government, with tax reductions and, you know, government money coming in there, because they cannot afford to lose Intel's manufacturing capability in case something happens in Taiwan. So I think, you know, although everything is very dark for Intel, if you are interested in Intel, I will do a video about it next, and I've done many videos about Intel, and I think most people are underestimating the potential there. So anyways, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and see you in the next one.